What if I told you that Legolas had already looked into the eyes of two other wizards before he ever set foot in Rivendell? Not Gandalf, who he would have known through the long years of the Third Age, through the White Council's deliberations and the deepening shadow over Mirkwood. Not Saruman, who stayed in his tower and his increasingly private concerns. The other two, the ones nobody names when they are debating who the best wizard is. The ones the Peter Jackson films quietly pretend do not exist. The ones who may have changed the outcome of the War of the Ring more decisively than any sword drawn at Helm's Deep. This is not something I have invented. This is not a theory assembled from desperation and a desire to make Legolas more interesting than 3 films of running and shooting left him. This is what emerges when you follow the geography of Middle-earth all the way east, past the borders of what the films ever showed you, through the pages of unfinished tales and peoples of Middle-earth, and the very specific wording of Tolkien's letter to Unleaven, and you hold those sources against the fact of where Legolas grew up, what kind of kingdom Thranduil actually ran, and who would have needed what that kingdom could provide. And then you ask the question that the text makes possible, but never answers. Did Legolas keep silent at the Council of Elrond, not because he had nothing to say, but because some oaths are heavier than the weight of the world? Let me start where the story starts. Not with Legolas, with the Istari, 5 of them, and the difference between the 3 that everybody knows and the 2 that everybody forgets is not just a matter of screen time or narrative focus. It is a matter of entirely different mandates for an entirely different theater of war. Tolkien was precise about this in Unfinished Tales. He was more precise still in the late essay published in Peoples of Middle-earth. The 5 wizards arrived in Middle-earth in the Third Age, each carrying a specific mandate from the Valar that shaped everything they would do in the centuries that followed. Sauron was sent to work against Sauron, but became fascinated by his own version of power. Radagast was sent to tend the natural world and became so absorbed in it that he lost the strategic picture. Gandalf held to his mission with remarkable fidelity, which is why he succeeded when the others failed. And then there were the 2 whose names most fans cannot remember. Tolkien called them LOTR and Pelennor in Unfinished Tales. He gave them different names later. In Peoples of Middle-earth, a more considered, and in many ways more deliberate work, he named them Morinitar and Romestamo, not changed their names, gave them the names they chose for their Eastern work, and that distinction matters. Morinitar translates as Darkness Slayer. Romestamo translates as East Hooper. These are operational names, names chosen by beings who had looked at their mission, understood its nature, and decided to identify themselves by what they were doing, rather than by who they were in Valinor. Their mission, as Tolkien described it, was unlike anything Gandalf was doing in the West, not advising kings, not counseling wise men, not serving as an inspirational figure who could kindle courage in ordinary hearts and walk into the Shire in his own name and be welcomed. The Blue Wizards were sent to go where Sauron's power was being cultivated across an age, where the armies of the East were being assembled, and the alliances that would eventually send hundreds of thousands of soldiers marching toward the Black Gate were being forged in loyalty and fear, and long generations of ideological conditioning, and they were sent to break those alliances from the inside, invisibly, over centuries. That is not a glamorous mission. There are no visible victories in what they did. No battles recorded in the appendices. No chapter in the Return of the King celebrating the army that did not arrive. And they did it. Or something very like it. Because when the War of the Ring came, the armies of the East and South were not the overwhelming force they should have been, given Sauron had spent an age assembling them. Tolkien himself acknowledged this in Letter to Unleaven. He wrote that the Blue Wizards may have had a lot to do with the failure of Sauron's designs in the East. The hedge in that sentence is doing significant work. It is Tolkien saying, I know what happened, I can see the result, I cannot prove the full cause. But the result is what it is, and two Maiar working in the East for 2,000 years is a sufficient explanation. The result is a gap. The gap between the Eastern force Sauron should have commanded, and the one that actually arrived at Minas Tirith. That gap is where this story lives. Now here is what you have to do, and most people never do it when they think about Middle-earth. You have to look at where things actually are in relation to each other. Not in the broad sweep of Mordor is southeast and the Shire is northwest, which everyone knows. In the specific geographic logic of the Third Age, what borders what that means for the people who operate in those border zones. Mirkwood, the great forest of the north that Thranduil ruled, and that Legolas was born into, sits on the map of Middle-earth in a position that is strategically crucial, in a way the films never dramatized. It is the border, the westernmost significant boundary of the corridor through which anything or anyone moving between the eastern lands and the western world had to pass. To the east of Mirkwood lies the Sea of Run. Beyond that lie the vast territories of the Easterlings, the peoples of Rhûn and the lands further east, the populations that Sauron had been cultivating for the full length of the Third Age. And the Blue Wizard's route east from any western staging point runs directly along the northern and eastern margins of Mirkwood. This is not a minor geographic coincidence. It is the foundational fact of the argument. The Blue Wizards traveled east, but the east is a direction, not a fixed destination. And the corridor through which a Maia, traveling east from the west of Middle-earth, would pass, runs directly through the zone that Thranduil's scouts controlled. Not just on the initial transit. Across 2,000 years of covert operations in the east, any Blue Wizard who needed to return briefly to the western side of the border, whether for intelligence transfer or resupply or simple recovery from the grinding work of 2 millennia of underground resistance operations, would pass through Mirkwood's margins. And Thranduil's scouts were not casual observers. This is what the unfinished tales makes explicit in the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. The woodland realm spent the Third Age holding a contested border against Sauron's pressure from Dol Guldur in the south and the eastern approaches. To hold that border, they had to know what was moving on the other side of it. They had to maintain networks that extended to the edges of Run. They had to be, in the most practical sense of the term, an intelligence organization embedded in a forest that sat at the junction of the western world and the eastern one. Legolas was the prince of that organization. From birth, from training, from the accumulated wisdom of a father who had watched the forest change across the full depth of the Third Age, Legolas would have understood the eastern border not as a wall, but as a membrane. Things passed through it, not always visible things, not always things that announce themselves. And the prince of the woodland realm was expected to know the difference between something passing through that needed to be stopped and something passing through that needed to be acknowledged, received, and then allowed to continue. That distinction requires judgment, it requires patience, and it requires, sometimes, the capacity to carry what you know without sharing it with anyone. Picture this. The great forest of Mirkwood in an earlier century of the Third Age, before the shadow has deepened as far as it will deepen by the time of the War of the Ring. The trees here are the original trees of the Greenwood the Great, back when that name still meant something hopeful. The canopy is dense enough that even on a clear day the light on the forest floor is the color of old gold, diffused through layers of leaf and branch. A prince of the woodland realm is in the upper branches, moving through the canopy, the way water moves through an open hand naturally, leaving no trace. He is watching the eastern tree line because that is what he was taught to do before he was old enough to understand why. The east is always watched. The east is always the direction from which things that cannot announce themselves arrive. Two figures emerge from the shadow of the eastern path, and everything changes. They are wearing mortal bodies, clothed in the specific kind of aging that the Istari adopt, worn not by time the way mortals are worn, but by a choice to appear worn, as though the burden of centuries is something they have decided to let show on their faces. Their robes are travel-stained in a way that suggests journeys longer than mortal lives. Their eyes are the thing that gives them away to someone who knows what to look for. Which Legolas does, because Thranduil has been preparing him for exactly this kind of encounter for longer than he can measure. The eyes carry a stillness that is not mortal, not the stillness of elves, which is the stillness of something ancient and patient. Something older than that, something that remembers the Ainulindale not as a text but as an experience. The music before the world was made, remembered in the substance of a being who was present when it was sung. He drops from the branch, lands without sound, faces them. They introduce themselves, not with the names they carry in the West, with the names they have chosen for their Eastern work. He listens. And for the first time in his long life, a prince of the woodland realm listens to beings who are older than his world and understands that he is being trusted with something that will not fit inside the ordinary categories of knowledge and secrecy and strategy. They tell him what they need. They tell him what they can offer in return. They tell him, most carefully, what they cannot afford to have said aloud, in any room to anyone, regardless of how trustworthy that person appears to be. He considers this. He thinks about his father, who would want to know. He thinks about Gandalf, who would probably guess at least the shape of it. He thinks about the White Council, which has always been a few steps behind the actual geography of the war being fought in the East. And he gives his word, not because he was forced to. Because the request was reasonable, the reasons behind it were sound, and an elf of Thranduil's line does not refuse a reasonable request made by a Maya of Pelennor when the alternative is the kind of ignorance that gets entire populations killed. The oath goes into him the way a root goes into stone, quietly, without drama, permanently. He watches them go east, back into the shadow that is their particular theater of war. He turns back toward the trees. The forest is exactly the same as it was an hour ago. He is different. In a way he will carry for the rest of an age. He does not forget. He never will. Now here is the thing about silence in Tolkien's legendarium. It is never empty. The entire mythological structure of the stories Tolkien told, from the Ainulindale at the beginning of the Silmarillion, through the close of the Third Age, in the appendices of The Return of the King, is built in its deepest structural layer on the mechanics and consequences of binding promises. The Oath of Fëanor is the engine of the entire First Age's tragedy. The Oath of the Dead Men of Dunharrow is what makes Aragorn's army at the paths, of the dead possible, summoned from centuries of unfulfilled obligation. The Oath of the Eldar to return to Valinor sits under the entire arc of elven history in Middle-earth. Oaths in Tolkien's world are not simply moral commitments. They are ontological ones. They change what a being is capable of doing, because a promise sincerely made binds something in the substance of the promiser. Apply that framework to a specific scenario. A Maya of the Order of the Istari, operating covertly in a region where a single intelligence breach could unravel a network built over centuries, approaches a prince of an elven border kingdom and offers access to certain intelligence in exchange for absolute discretion. Not the discretion of a soldier following orders. Not the discretion of someone asked politely to keep a secret. The discretion of an oath, a binding promise made freely to a Maya, in full understanding of what is at stake. Elves are not careless with such promises. They carry them with perfect clarity across any number of centuries. And they do not break them because circumstances change, or because the need seems urgent, or because everyone around them is clearly working toward the same goal and would obviously benefit from the information. They hold the oath. Because the oath is not conditional. Because the people who required it understood that conditional oaths break exactly when they are most needed to hold. Because the whole point of requiring an oath rather than simply requesting secrecy is to create a promise that does not rely on continuous rational recalculation to survive. Legolas in the Council of Elrond is not withholding information because he is unintelligent or because he fails to understand its relevance. He is withholding it because a Maya told him to, a very long time ago, in the forest at the edge of his world, and the Maya's reasons were good enough that the oath still holds. Go back to the Council of Elrond. Not the film's version, which is a spectacular piece of cinematic shorthand, but not the text. The text in the Fellowship of the Ring. The Council is not a meeting of people who all have the same information. It is an assemblage of partial perspectives, each participant carrying a fragment of the intelligence picture, none holding the complete one. Gandalf knows the history of the One Ring and the details of Gollum's confession. Aragorn knows the state of the Dunedain's long watch in the north. Boromir knows the military situation of Gondor. Legolas is present for a specific purpose, to report on the escape of Gollum from the woodland realm. Pay attention to what Legolas does not say. He does not offer strategic intelligence about Sauron's movements in the east. He does not reference anything about the state of the eastern alliances. He does not mention any context that would suggest he carries the kind of broad strategic picture that a prince of a border kingdom, with centuries of experience watching the eastern marches of Middle-earth, would naturally have accumulated. He reports the escape. He accepts the criticism it represents. He participates in the deliberations about the Fellowship. And then he is largely, conspicuously silent about anything that is not directly relevant to the stated reason for his presence. Here is where it gets strange, because the easy reading of that silence is that he is a warrior, not a strategist, that he is there for a specific purpose and he performs that purpose, that a prince of the woodland realm would not have the kind of broader intelligence that would be useful to the council in any case. But the lore does not support the easy reading, because a prince of the woodland realm, after several thousand years of life at the eastern border of the elven world, watching Sauron's shadow in Dol Guldur grow from a whisper to a shape, maintaining his father's intelligence networks that extended to the margins of Run, would have a strategic picture that nobody else at that council possessed. He would know things about Sauron's eastern preparations, or the failures of those preparations, that Gandalf did not know, that Elrond did not know, that no one who spent the Third Age in Rivendell or Lothlorien or the Grey Havens could know, because those places looked west. Only Mirkwood's border looked east, and he said almost nothing. The silence is not emptiness. It is the shape of what cannot be said. It is the form an oath takes when it is being honored in a room where breaking it would be natural and useful, and almost impossible to resist. To understand what the Blue Wizards were doing that made such an oath necessary, you have to understand their mission at a level of specificity that the broad overview skips past. They were not missionaries. They were not generals commanding armies. They were operating deep in the east among peoples who had been under Sauron's influence for generations, in some cases for the entire length of the age, and the methods required to work in that environment were nothing like Gandalf's methods in the west. Gandalf could walk into the Shire in his own name. Gandalf could speak openly at the Council of Elrond. The Blue Wizards operated in an environment where being publicly identified as servants of the Valar would not merely compromise their mission. It would end it, and probably end them. In Peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien is careful about the names he gives them. Morinheftar and Romestamo are not the names they were given in Valinor. They are the names they chose for their eastern work. The names of function rather than identity. Names of people who understood that in their theater, what you are called is a security matter. Now think about who they could trust in the West if they needed to communicate anything of significance. Not Saruman. Tolkien makes clear in Unfinished Tales that Saruman began his slide toward private ambition early in the Third Age, that his interest in the Rings of Power was always slightly off-angle from the mandate he had been given. Communicating through Saruman meant communicating through a mind that was not fully aligned with the mission. Gandalf was the obvious candidate, and perhaps some communication happened through him, but Gandalf operated in the West, in Eriador, in the Shire and Rivendell, and the circles of Western power. Getting intelligence to Gandalf required a relay point, a location in the geography of Middle-earth, where the Eastern network could touch the Western one without either side being exposed. The Woodland Realm. Mirkwood's eastern border, the kingdom that spent the Third Age with one eye permanently on the east. This is not invented logic. It is the logic of geography and operational necessity, mapped onto the cosmological rules Tolkien established about how covert operations work in Middle-earth. Maiar operating in secrecy do not abandon secrecy when they need to communicate. They use intermediaries. They use the only reliable border kingdom sitting between their operational theater and the powers of the West. And the prince of that kingdom is now standing in Rivendell, in the Council of Elrond, listening to some of the wisest and most powerful beings left in Middle-earth debate what they know about the enemy. He knows something they do not know, and he holds it. Picture this. A second meeting, later in the Third Age, after the shadow of Dol Guldur has deepened, and Thranduil's people have retreated north, and the Greenwood has become a name, whispered with dread, rather than said with the pride it used to carry. The forest in the northeastern marches, where the trees are still relatively clean, where the ancient oaks remember a time before the darkness came south. An elven prince, centuries older now in the way that elves are older, when the world has spent centuries pressing its full weight against their particular corner of it, stands at the edge of a clearing. He has been here before. The clearing knows him, in the way that particular places in ancient forests know the particular people who return to them often enough. The figures who emerge from the eastern shadow are familiar, not the faces exactly, because the mortal forms the Istari wear do age in their particular way, a deliberate aging that communicates the weight of what they carry more than any physical decline. But the eyes are the same. The eyes are always the same. They carry something that does not change with the body it inhabits. They do not stay long. They never stay long. They tell him what the shape of things looks like from the east, not the specifics. The specifics belong to the eastern network, and he is of the western border, but the broad outline, the architecture of what is coming, the condition of Sauron's preparations, and the degree to which those preparations have been disrupted by the long work they have been doing. What he needs to know about the failure of the Eastern alliances that will matter when the war finally arrives. What he gives them in return is what he knows from the western side of the border. The White Council's movements, the state of Dol Guldur's pressure on Mirkwood, the intelligence his scouts have gathered from the eastern margins. He watches them go east again, back into the shadow where the free peoples do not follow. He turns back toward the trees. The oath sits in him, not pressing, not painful, just present. The way something carried long enough stops feeling like a burden and begins to feel like a part of you. He does not forget. He never will. Here is what the military mathematics of the War of the Ring look like from Sauron's perspective before the war arrived and disrupted all his calculations. At the beginning of the Third Age, Sauron's plans in the east were not a side project. They were a central strategic pillar. The peoples of Rhûn, the Easterlings who would march on Gondor, the Varigs of Khand, the Haradrim from the south. Together they should have represented a force so overwhelming that the combined strength of the free peoples of the West could not withstand it. Even with the destruction of the One Ring, even with Sauron's loss of direct control over his armies, the sheer material weight of an Eastern force, assembled across 3,000 years of preparation, should have been sufficient to grind Gondor and Rohan to rubble. But the Eastern Alliance never fully materialized. The Easterlings who marched on Minas Tirith were real, and they were dangerous, and they very nearly decided the Battle of Pelennor Fields in Sauron's favor. But they were a fraction of what Sauron had been assembling for an age. The Haradrim were powerful, but not numerous enough on their own to be decisive. And the deeper eastern reserves, the populations furthest from the west, who should have represented Sauron's overwhelming strategic depth, were not there in the numbers that 3,000 years of imperial cultivation should have produced. Letter 211 gives you the explanation. 2,000 years of quiet work. Two Maiar going east, again and again, into the lands where Sauron was building his eastern empire, not confronting his forces in open battle, where the result could be recorded in any chronicle, but dismantling the trust and coordination and ideological coherence that made the empire work. Cultivating local resistance, turning loyal vassals into doubters, and doubters into quiet saboteurs, and quiet saboteurs into the fractures that run through an army when it is called to march, and the call does not produce the numbers it should. That is the victory nobody commemorates at Cormallen. That is the reason the destruction of the ring was sufficient to end the war, rather than simply removing one piece of Sauron's power while his eastern armies rolled over everything that remained. And somewhere in the eastern marches of Mirkwood, across the centuries when this invisible work was being done, there was an elf who knew the shape of it, not the operational details, not the names and locations and specific methods, but the shape. A sense of what was being accomplished in the east and what it was costing the beings who were doing it. Now picture this, the Battle of Pelennor Fields. An ancient elven prince on the walls of a city that has been burning for a day and a night, watching the largest engagement of the Third Age develop below on the plains, and understanding something about what he is seeing that no one else on those walls can understand. The Easterlings are real. He can see them massing in the grey light before full dawn, filing across the Pelennor toward the city walls. They are not symbolic. They are the actual physical descendants of the peoples that two Maiar spent 2,000 years quietly trying to fracture and subvert. And here they are, marching under a banner he knows too well, part of what remains of Sauron's eastern force after 2 millennia of resistance work. Part of what remains, that is the knowledge he carries. That is what nobody else on the wall knows. These warriors are dangerous, and they are real, and they will kill people he has traveled with, and come to hold something like love for. But they are not the full Eastern force. They are the fraction that survived 2,000 years of invisible attrition by 2 Maiar, whose names nobody in this battle knows. He has lived long enough to do the arithmetic, the math of what is here against the math of what should be here, and in that gap between should and is lies the entire invisible weight of the Blue Wizard's campaign, measured now not in operations or intelligence transfers or covert cultivations of local resistance, but in the people who are not dying on this field. Today, because the full Eastern army did not arrive, he fights, he watches, he holds his silence, because even here, even now, the oath still requires it. Because the Eastern network may still be functioning. Because you do not dismantle 2,000 years of covert infrastructure by talking about it on a battlefield. He wins the battle. He carries the knowledge. He does not say it, he never says it. After the war, after Aragorn's coronation and the long celebration and the slow reconstruction of what was broken, after the Fellowship's long dissolution, as each member returns to their own life and their own kind of grief and recovery. Legolas hears the gulls. Tolkien documents this in the appendices to The Return of the King. The sea longing, the elvish yearning toward the west that once it takes hold does not release, came to Legolas at Pelagir when he heard the cry of seabirds from the Anduin's mouth. And once it woke, it did not rest. Not a preference. Not a desire that can be managed into quietness. a pull that will eventually become irresistible, in the specific way that the call of Pelennor is irresistible to the elves who have lived long enough and far enough from the sea to feel its full weight when it finally reaches them. Legolas knows what this means. He is going west. Eventually, not yet. There is Aragorn, whose final years Legolas intends to witness with the full attention of someone who has loved a mortal friend and understands what that love costs an elf. There is Ithilien, which he has begun to restore, coaxing the scarred land around Gondor back into something that deserves to be called a garden. There is Gimli, who is a different kind of miracle entirely, a dwarf who has seen enough to want to see the undying lands, and whose company Legolas intends to keep for whatever time remains between them. But eventually there is the ship, and the grey sea, and the shore on the other side. Here is what the canonical record of the Blue Wizards adds to that eventual arrival. In Tolkien's notes on the Istari in Unfinished Tales, the question of where the Blue Wizards ended is left more open than the fates of the other. 3. Saruman was destroyed, his spirit dispersing rather than returning west, the consequence of the fundamental corruption of his mission. Radagast remained in Middle-earth, absorbed into the natural world he had chosen over the strategic one. Gandalf returned in glory to Pelennor with the ring-bearers. The Blue Wizards, Tolkien's notes suggest, may have returned to the west after their mission was complete, in the way that Maiar, whose earthly work is finished, returned to the presence of the Valar who sent them. Which means that when Legolas's ship touches the shore of Pelennor, the beings who stood at the edge of his forest a very long time ago and asked him to carry something may already be there, waiting, in whatever form Maiar take when they are finally home and no longer constrained to the mortal bodies their mission required. Think about that moment, an elf stepping off a ship onto a shore that is not quite the shore of any world he has sailed through, and looking up and meeting eyes that he last met in the forest of Mirkwood, over a promise made in the shadow of trees that are now dust. What does it mean to set down something you have carried for so long that the carrying had become part of what you are? What is the word, in whatever language they speak at the edge of the world, for the specific feeling of an oath finally lifting? The legendarium does not tell us. It was never meant to. That silence is itself the point. Did Legolas keep silent at the Council of Elrond not because he had nothing to say, but because some oaths are heavier than the weight of the world? Ask that question now, with the geography in your mind. Mirkwood's eastern border, the Blue Wizard's corridor into Ron, the operational necessity of a western relay point at exactly the location where Thranduil's kingdom sat. A prince trained from birth to watch the eastern horizon and to understand what he saw there. Ask it with the lore in your mind. Peoples of Middle-earth's account of Moriniftar and Romestamo and their explicitly covert mission to stir up resistance in the east. Letter 211. And Tolkien's own careful acknowledgement that the Blue Wizards may have been responsible for the failure of Sauron's eastern designs. The Unfinished Tales' description of the Woodland Realm as an active intelligence-gathering border kingdom that spent the Third Age under pressure from exactly the direction the Blue Wizards operated. Ask it with the weight of the legendarium's oath structure behind it. The world Tolkien built is one where promises made to Maiar do not expire because circumstances change, where the things most worth keeping are exactly the things most worth keeping silent about, where the measure of wisdom is sometimes the willingness to hold knowledge alone, without credit, without acknowledgement, so that something larger than yourself can function. He sat in the Council of Elrond and knew something, and held it. He stood at Pelennor and understood the arithmetic of absence and said nothing. He sailed west eventually, carrying the oath still, because some things are not released until the one who gave them gives them back. That is not a footnote. That is not the side story of a character the films reduced to an arrow count. That is the hidden architecture of the victory, the part nobody commemorates because nobody knew it existed. Now here is what this means. Not just about Legolas, but about the kind of story Tolkien was actually telling. Across all of it, from the Ainulindale to the sailing of the Lasopgosh, Tolkien was a veteran. He watched people die in mud for objectives that were never fully explained, and victories that never felt like what victory was supposed to feel like. And he built a mythology, not in spite of that experience, but because of it, that was specifically designed to honor the people who did the necessary invisible work, the ones whose contributions could not be named without undoing them, the ones who showed up in no chronicle, because showing up in a chronicle would have been evidence of failure. In The Return of the King, at the celebration on the field of Cormoran, Gandalf tells the assembled host that they have succeeded because of the courage of small creatures, of Frodo and Sam carrying the ring into the heart of the enemy's land. He is right. He is also incomplete, because the victory at Cormoran rested on a foundation built by two Maya, whose names the assembled host could not pronounce, whose work in the East they did not know about, whose success is visible only in its negative space, in the armies that did not fully arrive, in the alliances that did not fully hold, in the gap between what Sauron should have commanded and what he was actually able to bring to bear. Perhaps one elf standing in the celebration on the field of Cormoran knew what was missing from the accounting. Not bitterly, not with resentment, with something more complicated and more costly than resentment, with the kind of understanding that only comes from carrying knowledge for a very long time and knowing that the knowledge did its work whether or not it was ever spoken. Some victories are not celebrated. Some sacrifices do not produce songs. Some oaths are kept not because keeping them will be rewarded, but because the oath itself was a recognition that something larger than personal credit was at stake. And the measure of a person, in Tolkien's world, is not always what they did, but what they chose to carry alone so that others could move freely. Legolas chose to carry it, for an age, in silence that was not emptiness but fullness, the fullness of a promise kept and a trust honored and a war quietly won in places where no poem would ever look. Tolkien did not just build a world, he built the shadow of a world. He built the light and the music and the heroes and the great arcs of history that march across the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. But what he built the light for was to cast the shadows. And the shadows are where the most important histories live. The Blue Wizards are one of those shadows. 2 of the 5 Istari sent on a mission that was arguably more decisive to the survival of the West than anything Gandalf did in the open history of the Third Age, operating in a theater that produced no songs and no named battles and no celebrated victories. Returning to the West, if they returned at all, in silence and without ceremony. Present in the Legendarium mostly as a gap, a reference point, an acknowledgement that the world was larger than what the maps of the West ever showed. Legolas is one of those shadows too, not because he is unimportant, because he is important in the specific way that things are important when they do their work invisibly, when the evidence of their significance is not what they did in the visible record but what they carried, and what they chose not to say, and the weight that accumulated in them across the long years of carrying it. The Legendarium rewards careful reading. It rewards the kind of attention that follows geographic logic past the comfortable limits of what has been dramatized. It rewards the reader who asks why a prince of a border kingdom with millennia of intelligence experience said so little at the Council of Elrond, and follows that question east past the tree line of Mirkwood, past the shores of Run, into the territory where 2 forgotten Maiar were doing the most important work of the Third Age, while nobody in the councils of the West knew it was happening. That reader is you, if you have stayed with this to the end. And the question you are sitting with now is the one this channel is built to, open rather than to close. Did Legolas keep silent not because he had nothing to say, but because some oaths are heavier than the weight of the world? The answer is in the gap between what Tolkien wrote and what the Legendarium implies. It is in the geography of Mirkwood, and the Blue Wizard's mission corridor. It is in the structure of elven oaths and the operational requirements of a covert network. It is in the silence of an ancient prince in a room full of the wisest people left in Middle-earth, making decisions about a war whose outcome had already been partially secured by people they would never thank. Tolkien made the world big enough for this. He made it deep enough that following its implications takes you further than you expected. And he made it honest enough that the silence at its center is not an absence, but a shape. The shape of everything that was done and not recorded, promised and not broken, carried and never set down until the ship touched the shore of Pelennor, and the Oathgiver was already there, waiting, and the long silence could finally become something else. That is the kind of lore the Legendarium holds in its shadows. And if this is the world you want to keep exploring, there is more. The Legendarium has rooms nobody has opened yet. We are going through them one locked door at a time. Subscribe, and come back when the next door opens.